Dr. Horne, and author of dozens of books, a virtual one-man library to educate and agitate and organize, whose newest book, just released, is African Americans and a New History of the U.S. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
This Monday, it marks the 4th anniversary of Donald Trump's deadly January 6th insurrection. 9 people died and more than 150 people were injured as a result of the white supremacist attack on the Capitol. 1,500 people were charged with crimes related to the insurrection. Gerald Horne, in understanding the significance of January the 6th, that date of infamy in U.S. history, I believe that the insurrection must be seen as the successful staging ground, not the failed, the successful staging ground, the stagecraft that ushered into power this time Trump, and who has pledged to pardon the insurrectionists, continuing his pattern of promoting violence, corruption, and favors for MAGA thugs, a kind of brown shirt loyalist to complete the assumption to power of a fascist government, albeit American style. Gerald Horne, what is your analysis of Trump's assumption to the presidency and January 6th, and what does it portend, including Trump's pardon, he says, of those involved in the insurrection?
Well, historically, I think it's fair to suggest that January 6, 2021 can be seen as a kind of replay of Mussolini's March on Rome in the 1920s, which prefigured the rise of fascism, not least in Europe. Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to suggest that we may be in a pre-fascist moment. And I say that because the right wing in this country have constructed this heads we win, tails you lose scenario. That is to say, when they lose, such as in the November 2020 election, they stage an insurrection, an attempted fascist coup. And when they apparently win in November 2024, well, then all is peaches and cream, so to speak. We should not be surprised by this turn of events. After all, this is a nation that was constructed on indigenous genocide, on enslavement of Africans, on U.S. apartheid, and therefore the womb has ever been fertile for the rise of fascism. And I think it's also fair to suggest that with the impending pardon of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 or more defendants who were tried and convicted as a result of this so-called insurrection on January 6, 2021, you basically see the freeing of a core of what you correctly suggest may be potential brown shirts. We should also see these defendants as a heterogeneous mass that mimics the GOP base. That is to say, on January 6, 2021, you had CEOs flying in on private planes to participate in this failed coup. You had cops, military veterans, small business owners, lumpen elements in profusion. In other words, it was not unlike the origins and roots of settler colonialism itself, inaugurated English style in what they call North Carolina in the 1580s. That is to say, settler colonialism, U.S. style, inverts the class question. In other words, you should expect the kind of class collaboration that you witnessed on January 6, 2021 to be a hallmark of what has been established in this country going back to the 1580s. And of course, that's key to understanding the 75 million strong Trump base. We should also focus on the fact that of these defendants, they were heavily from Dixie, not only from Virginia, which after all is just across the water from Washington, but also from Texas. from Florida. Those two states, which were bulwarks of the so-called Confederate States of America, contributed disproportionately to those who were arrested on January 6th. And it helps to animate this notion that many historians are now grappling with, which is that the so-called Confederate States of America, which tried to overthrow the United States government once again in 1861 as a result of launching civil war, they lost militarily, but in many ways they won politically. And we're still suffering the after effects of that political victory. Now, at the top of the pyramid, to be sure, are those like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who, of course, has made a hash of the Washington Post, not least by forcing out a cartoonist who tried to draw a cartoon that lands Mr. Bezos because of his bending the knee to Mr. Trump. Of course, there's there's Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook Meta, who has added Joel Kaplan, a former GOP leader, to his board, and also Dana White, a Trump comrade from this mixed martial arts empire. And of course, there's Elon Musk, who is probably the most dangerous of all, insofar as he's now interfering in the internal affairs of Britain by stumping for the so-called Reform Party and stumping for Tommy Robinson, one of the leaders of the British far right. He has been reprimanded and rebuked by President Macron of France and Chancellor Scholz of Berlin, but it may be too little too late with regard to their reprimands, because, of course, in Germany, he's also been stumping for the so-called Alternative for Germany, the descendants of the Nazis, who have a good chance of coming to power in Berlin, which will obviously put wind in the sails of this pre-fascist movement in the United States of America. And speaking of which, I would be remiss if I failed to note the rise of the neo-Nazi Freedom Party in Austria. What happens in Austria oftentimes prefigures what happens in Germany, as we noticed in the 1930s. That is to say that there are global trends that are propelling fascism. And sadly, I think there are too few in our movement who are paying attention to these global trends. However, they're certainly paying attention in Panama, where Mr. Trump has made threats to seize the Panama Canal. They're paying attention in Denmark, where Mr. Trump has made threats to seizing the colonial territory that is Greenland from Denmark. And certainly they're paying attention north of the border, where in Canada, just today, Prime Minister Trudeau was forced out of office. And one of the many reasons he was forced out of office was because of the pressure on Ottawa from Mr. Trump, referring disrespectfully to this neighbor as the 51st state and referring disrespectfully to Mr. Trudeau as Governor Trudeau. In other words, as part of this pre-fascist movement in the United States, there is a defined tendency to convert so-called allies like Canada into neo-colonial appendages. This may even be extended to powers like the European Union and Great Britain. Recall that Mr. Trump has threatened London and Brussels. That is to say, they need to buy more U.S. energy and more arms from the U.S. military-industrial complex, or face tariffs, that is to say, taxes on their exports to the United States of America. In other words, he's trying to enlist these so-called allies into the MAGA movement. That is to say, to contribute revenue to the U.S. Treasury so that Mr. Trump can cut taxes for his billionaires like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk. The danger for Mr. Trump, fortunately, is that these countries are not without weapons themselves. Pay close attention to what might be a real game changer, which is the gathering entente between Japan and China, because, of course, Mr. Trump has also made threats against those two Asian giants. Note as well that Sir Keir Starmer, who has criticized Elon Musk, is booking a flight to China within the next few weeks. Pay attention to what emerges from that particular meeting. And we should also not neglect the kind of religious zealotry which is spreading worldwide, which is feeding this pre-fascist movement. I'm not only talking about the United States of America, where you have these Christian extremists, particularly in my neck of the woods in Texas and nearby Oklahoma and Louisiana, who are promoting prayer in schools, posting the Ten Commandments in classrooms, and giving tax breaks to these so-called religious academies that are sponsored by Christian extremists. But of course, as your segment on Israel no doubt will suggest, there is the Jewish religious extremism that is buoying the Netanyahu government, that is buoying this effort at genocide in historic Palestine. And of course, I would be remiss if I ignored the Islamic so-called extremism, which has taken power in Damascus, the so-called rebranded Al-Qaeda and rebranded ISIS. And if you believe press reports, there is a schizophrenic response by the U.S. ruling class insofar as they are welcoming this tendency in Damascus, but denouncing it if it manifests itself, as we are told, in New Orleans. And that brings me, I'm afraid to say, to the late sainted Jimmy Carter, who helped to propel these trends. In 1978, his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, helped to fund and subsidize religious zealotry in Afghanistan in order to destabilize an ally of the then Soviet Union. That paid dividends for the zealots from their point of view on September 11, 2001, with the attack on New York and Washington. But in 1978 as well, you saw Mr. Brzezinski in his anti-Soviet, anti-Moscow psychosis, welcoming paramount Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping to Washington for a 10-day visit, including a visit to CIA headquarters. He returns to his homeland, and in February 1979, launches a war against Vietnam, helping to assure Washington and Wall Street that China is reliable. The leader of the United Auto Workers, Leonard Woodcock, is appointed as first U.S. ambassador to post-revolutionary, post-1949 China, which helps to facilitate the massive relocation of the U.S. manufacturing facility across the Pacific, which has now created this juggernaut in China, which bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust, and at the same time has ignited this general crisis of imperialism that Mr. Trump is both a symbol of and is responding to with these rather ominous threats in terms of war games, targeting the People's Republic of China, although it's difficult to think that that can be separated from the rise of the Chinese manufacturing capability in terms of COMAC, which is challenging Boeing, in terms of airplane manufacturing, and BYD, which is challenging Ford and General Motors as well. And once again, back home, we should not ignore the fact that this crisis is manifesting itself quite horribly on these shores. I'm speaking of the slaughter of Robert Brooks, a black man executed without due process of law by the hands of the state, the George Floyd of 2025. He's an exemplar, I'm afraid to say, of the centuries-long war against Africans by settler colonialists and their minions. We see this as well with these scare headlines about impending mass deportations starting within days, perhaps targeting New York City in the first instance, Midtown hotels, the Floyd Bennett airfield, and of course, your mayor, Mayor Adams, is so compromised with these indictments hanging over his head, he'll probably feel compelled to compromise with Mr. Trump in the White House so that he might be able to wrangle a pardon. In any case, This is the bitter fruit of January 6, 2021, pre-fascism that can blossom into full-blown fascism if we do not organize, agitate, and educate.
Well, I'm wondering if we can just return for a moment to the Biden administration, which has, in its waning days, its final days, it needed to give $18 billion more to munitions for the state that's $8 billion. Let's not overdo it. It's not $18 billion. It's $8 billion that is being proposed. So I'm wondering, in terms of understanding the state of imperialism, and what I am certainly suggesting is the ushering in of a fascist structure. I believe that there really has been a consolidation of fascism under this Trump administration, this Trump presidency that really was aided and abetted by the stagecraft that was part of January 6th. So they have the highest courts. They have most of the federal court judges in their bag. They have the two houses, really, for all intents and purposes. And the question then is, and I believe the brown shirts, as you referred to them and as I have referred to them similarly, is there now with the pardon that seems inevitable of the 1,500 or so people that were prosecuted for January 6th. So it seems to me that there's a real full court press for fascism, and then the coming together of the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and the genuflexing of people like Bezos, who gave $1 million to the inauguration fund. Are we, in your opinion, is this really a state of fascism that we have to understand? And how is it differentiated, or do you see it differentiated, certainly on the international front, from the Biden administration and his policies and practices in the Middle East, and with the absolute support and license of Israeli Zionism?
Well, certainly, as my previous comments suggested, we must look at both the Democrats and the Republicans through the lens of settler colonialism. We should not see it as accidental or coincidental that tens of millions in a settler colonial regime would tend to vote for the right or vote for those who prepare the grounds for the right. You mentioned Elon Musk, and there hangs a tale, because I don't think our movement has paid sufficient attention to the fact that not only is Mr. Musk hailing from apartheid South Africa, but many of the leaders of Silicon Valley similarly have roots in that ignominious region pre-1994. I'm speaking of Roelof Botha, a name that should ring a bell for those who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, since he's a lineal descendant of P.I.K. Botha, who was the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa. He is now a titan of Silicon Valley. I'm speaking of David Sachs, who has, just like Mr. Musk, joined the Trump team descending on Washington as of January 21st. I'm speaking of Peter Thiel. The only difference in his case is that his roots are in apartheid-ruled Namibia as opposed to apartheid South Africa. And I think that our inattention to this kind of connection is a sad symbol of our inattention to the pre-fascism that is descending on these shores. However, fortunately, it's not too late, not least because there may be contradictions emerging already within the Trump base. As you know, the internet is full to the brim with stories about the so-called MAGA civil war with Mr. Musk and the Silicon Valley tech bros clamoring for extensions of these H-1B visas. That is to say that the United States, as the inheritor of the British Empire, like London, seeks to exploit forevermore the labor of men, in particular from South Asia. It's no accident that the leaders of trillion-dollar corporations like Microsoft and Alphabet that controls Google have roots in South Asia, India in particular. But of course, the base is hotly opposed to the extension of these visas. Laura Loomer, a close comrade of Mr. Trump, has spoken of people of South Asia in very insulting and indeed racist terms. This may help to accelerate contradictions between New Delhi and Washington, because Washington is relying upon New Delhi in terms of his attempt to encircle the People's Republic of China based upon historic conflicts that have existed between those two Asian giants. And that might create an opening for a sophisticated anti-fascist movement to take advantage of. But to take advantage of that, you first have to be aware of these tensions and contradictions.
One of the things that in the time that we have left, I just want your thoughts on the Sahel area of Africa, where there has been a casting off of the remnants, certainly the troops and armies of colonialism, particularly the French. And I was interested in your particular thoughts as a sign of Africa's moving to further its independence and free itself from kind of comprador bourgeoisie class and so on. What you make of this effort to it's more than an effort, of this move unequivocally of a whole number of nations within the Sahel to free themselves from those manifestations of French colonialism?
Well, certainly it's a breath of fresh air. This effort by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger has been accompanied by a companion movement by their neighbor to the west, speaking of Senegal, which likewise has demanded that French troops leave their soil. Even in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, where President Ouattara is known as a placeman for Paris. In fact, there are stories that suggest that there is a trap door in his office leading to a tunnel that can direct him directly to the French embassy if there is any kind of uprising against him. But that story notwithstanding, he too has demanded that French troops leave the soil of his homeland. And I'm also happy to report that Wang Yi, who is the Chinese foreign minister, is continuing the notable perennial move by the Chinese foreign ministry to make its first foreign foray every year into Africa. This year, Wang Yi will be visiting Chad, just to the east of the Sahel nations, which too has demanded that French troops leave their soil. He's also visiting the Republic of the Congo, just across the Congo River from the larger Democratic Republic of the Congo. Recall that at the height of the Cold War, the Republic of the Congo Brazzaville, had fraternal relations with the Black Panther Party. That particular relationship tended to disintegrate with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but Wang Yi's visit might lead to a resuscitation of a version of that kind of alliance. He's also visiting the continent's giant, speaking of Nigeria, which of course borders Niger. He's also visiting Namibia. You may recall that this Southwest African nation historically has had close ties going back to the anti-apartheid struggle with Black Americans, and that opens the door once again to trying to develop an anti-Trump, anti-fascist alliance that's not only grounded domestically, but grounded globally.
And there's one last thought that I'd like to evoke from you, and that is, I thought this was a marvelous development and that is that the BRIC countries that have evolved, apparently Cuba, who has been saddled for decades with this horrifying embargo to strangle it economically and provoke dissatisfaction, this form of weaponizing sanctions with healthcare and other issues that the United States is frenzied about in terms of Cuba, Venezuela, and the like. Your thoughts about Cuba joining with the BRIC nations and what that portends for a state that I know you and certainly we at WBAI have been most in support of its development towards and movement towards the development of a socialist nation.
Well, that's another breath of fresh air. I'm happy to report news that your audience may be familiar with, which is that in the last few days, the People's Republic of China has unloaded 70 tons of heavy equipment in Cuba, designed in part to help to revive its flagging electrical system. This is a sign of solidarity. It's a sign that the Cuban association with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is already bearing dividends. Another perverse indication of what I just indicated is a vicious attack on the Cuban military in this morning's Wall Street Journal. It reflects the kind of hysteria that I think we're going to have to become accustomed to as imperialism descends further into crisis. And you mentioned at the top my latest book, African Americans and a New History of the United States of America. And one of the themes of that book is that Africans, people of African descent, have been a vector of class struggle, being the unpaid sector of the working class and then the victims of apartheid tendencies in the working class, which has not rested very well in a class collaborationist regime. And the way we've been able to square the circle to break the logjam is through internationalism, with a strategic imperative of our movement today being enhanced solidarity with the Cuban Revolution.
Well, Dr. Professor Gerald Horne, I really thank you, as always, for your analysis.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.